Welcome everyone to the seventh lecture in the BRED IGC Social Protection Series, and a warm welcome to Sandeep Sukhtankar, Professor of Economics at University of Virginia. We are excited to learn more today about digital technology and social protection. This is a topic that's cropped up a number of times in the questions over the series, so we're excited to learn more today and learn from Professor Sukhtankar. Just briefly, we'd like now to ask for 20 volunteers to become live participants. If you could raise your hand, we ask that you keep your mic muted and your camera on. And after this happens, all questions will be directed to the Q&A box in the chat. You might have noticed, but today we have one lecture instead of two. So please try to keep your questions limited, since we probably won't be able to cover as many as we normally do, and that will mainly happen in the Q&A section after the first hour of the lecture. Lastly, the recording and slides for this lecture will be put onto the IGC website, along with all those from previous and future lectures. So without further ado, I will hand over now to Professor Sukhtankar. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Caleb, and thank you everyone for joining. I'm really excited to see how many people are online and interested in this topic. So as I'm starting to share my screen, I want to point out that not only am I a professor and research fellow at BRED, I also sit on the board of the Digify Africa initiative of JPAL. And that is an initiative that is very much in line with the topic today, and encourages African scholars to apply to do research. So if this topic is something that you're interested in doing research on, please look us up. So today's topic, as you all know, is on the promise of digital technology in transforming social protection programs. But as in the title, there's also some pitfalls. So we're going to go through both the promises and pitfalls, and I'll go through lots of examples and a few case studies so you can get a sense of sort of what I am talking about. So the broad motivation is very, very obvious in some sense. Digital technology is ubiquitous. We are on Zoom, which is a form of digital technology, of course. And as everyone knows, that the growth has sort of exploded in the last 2 decades. A form of digital technology is digital public infrastructure. So this is something that the government can use to deliver social protection. It can use for other things as well, but for our purposes, it can be really, really useful. And what people have claimed, for example, the World Bank, it claims that this type of infrastructure can have a really transformative impact in today, just as sort of roads, railways, and other types of physical infrastructure fueled economic growth in previous centuries. Now, the reason that this type of infrastructure can really help is, as many of you will know, governments face really big challenges in delivering social protection programs. There's non-trivial hurdles in the developing world in doing something that seems really simple and straightforward. You have money, you want to give it to people. And that, when you say it like this, it sounds almost ridiculous, but we all know that there's a lot of challenges. So who do you want to give it to? So identifying who's vulnerable, who it should be targeted to. I know this was discussed in previous lectures as well, but targeting is really important. Then, even if you've decided and you know who you want to transfer funds to, on the way, the money could leak out, or it may not necessarily be money. It could be food, it could be fuel, fertilizer, other types of items that could form part of social protection programs, but those sort of trickle out on the way to the eventual beneficiary. And even if you've got it almost all the way, the very last mile, sending it from the delivery center or getting it from the agent in the hands of the government agent into the hands of people, in the hands of beneficiaries, might just be an enormous challenge. So in this context, you can imagine that there's a really attractive proposition here where a government bureaucrat sitting in the Capitol presses a button and the money goes out. It's digitally, electronically transferred to a bank account or to a mobile account to beneficiaries who have been sort of targeted automatically using data, digitally, machine learning, those kinds of things. And it's all automatic, and it's seamless, right? So this idea that you could actually do something today with digital public infrastructure is really powerful and has gotten a lot of people very excited. The problem, of course, is that the real world doesn't always work this way. You might end up with beneficiaries who could get excluded for various reasons. Maybe they don't have an account that can accept digital transfers. Maybe they don't have an ID that would get them targeted automatically. So that could be issues, and the problem is that those that are the most vulnerable, the poorest, are more likely to be the people that get excluded, and so that's somewhat problematic, especially when social protection is very much trying to reach these people. And then, of course, there's cost to building this public infrastructure, right? Just as you pay a lot of startup costs to build roads and railways, you pay a lot of startup costs to build up a digital ID system, to build up a public infrastructure capable of delivering electronic benefit transfers. Now, which is true, whether the promises outweigh the pitfalls, that's only going to be determined by research, by using representative data, using rigorous methods of research. And this struck me when I first started writing this paper, and it's still sort of true. There is just incredibly little rigorous causal research on these topics. There are hundreds and hundreds of different reports. They can be very glossy. They're produced in very fancy ways by different people trying to sell different systems. They're produced by governments themselves. But what I'm trying to say, and what I hope to convince you, is that those are not necessarily what we want to determine the causal impact of these technologies and whether the benefits of these technologies are outweighing the costs. Okay, so what we're going to do in the rest of the lecture is go through the details of what evidence we have. It's limited, but it's very good, on the potential benefits and costs, and then through specific examples with some case studies that will make this interesting from various different parts of the world. And then I'll open it up for Q&A at the end. So before we sort of begin, what I'm basically going to do is give you a overview of what digital technology and social protection looks like, and then we'll go through some of the promises, pitfalls. I'll end with some policy recommendations and questions that are still open. So before we begin, I want to make sure we're all on the same page and lay out some definitions and as well as some sort of restrictions on what I mean by digital technology and what I'm going to look at here. So again, hopefully all of you have attended the earlier classes and know already what we mean when we talk about social protection. And this comes from the readings for the very first lecture, where social protection refers to both redistributive programs, which are helping people who are poor, and social insurance programs, which are helping people who have gotten some kind of shock. Maybe there's a natural disaster or some other personal shock. And these are the two combined are what we refer to as social protection. So that's pretty straightforward. Perhaps maybe a little more contentious for some people will be my choice of what to focus on. So when digital technology is everywhere. Again, you could talk about Zoom, right? But we're not going to talk about Zoom. What we're going to talk about is specifically mobile phones, mobile money, digital payment systems, digital ID systems, and digital data. And why do we want this restriction? Well, these are all really, really prevalent, especially in the developing world, and have really high potential. They form pillars of digital public infrastructure. And so those can really be used in social protection. So that's, and I'll show you how that's done in a little while. There could be other things, but those might be a bit too broad, like the internet, or too specific. This could be a custom app, like the Zoom example I keep talking about. A lot of you might be very excited about the potential of generative AI. And that's sort of true. Maybe it does have potential, but at the moment, at least, there's just non-existent, really, I would say, evidence of use and basically whether it's working or not in a social protection sense. There may be a few pilots, but I'm talking about sort of rigorous vetted evidence. So that will be one of the open questions that we'll discuss at the end, and maybe we can talk a little bit about it in the Q&A. But for now, these are the 5 things that we will focus on. So why these 5 things? Well, as everyone again knows, mobile phones have just exploded over the last 15, 20 years or so in the developing world and elsewhere. And again, these data are probably already a little bit outdated, but there's about 12 billion cell phone connections, nearly 6 billion unique users. And that's basically, 3/4 of the world's population has a mobile phone, which is just unbelievable. Within these mobile phones, especially smartphones, are starting to really dominate. Most people now have smartphones rather than dumb phones. And if you look, I've just picked a few countries. You can play around with this data yourself. It's really fabulous data from the Our World and Data website. They have many other things too. But amongst the things that they have is this data on mobile phone subscriptions for 100 people over the last 45 years. And you'll see there's basically nothing going on early, but over the last 15, 20 years, there's just been absolutely huge explosions. And to the extent where places like Kenya now have more mobile phone subscribers per 100 people than the United States, right? So maybe China's not that surprising. Maybe Kenya is, not to people who live there or people from sub-Saharan Africa, but other parts of the world. Maybe this is a little bit surprising. So this is everywhere. The world, in the world overall, you have more. That 12 billion figure is higher than the world's population, and that's of course because people have multiple phone subscriptions per individual. So that's obviously really exciting. What is also very exciting is the ability to transfer money using these phone accounts. And the reason this is so exciting is because not many people, especially in developing countries, have bank accounts, right? So they don't, they may not necessarily have full-fledged bank accounts, but as we've just seen, lots of people, almost everybody has a cell phone, and so the ability to transfer money securely through the phone is really exciting. So there's billions of accounts, trillions of dollars in transactions through mobile money. And again, another chart from our world in data will show that actually most of this is happening in sub-Saharan Africa. This is really fantastic for many reasons, because when we think about development economics, when we think about the technology, we often talk about leapfrogging, right? And so in many ways, sub-Saharan Africa has sort of leapfrogged, in the sense of jumped over the hurdle, let's say, of traditional bank accounts, and now lots of people are using mobile money to make these secure transactions over space, rather than banks and physical cash. So that's you'll see the huge explosion. You'll see the big improvements in sub-Saharan Africa, but also other parts, East Asia, South Asia, and other parts of the world as well. So huge numbers of people with active mobile money accounts. And again, if you go to our world in data, you can play around with this yourselves. You can change you can look at specific countries, you can change the time frame, you can change the actual the outcome that's been used. So this is another really fun website to play around with. Again, I don't want to belabor the point, so I'm not going to go through other graphs, but we'll see, and we'll talk about all of these as we go along. There's, when we talk about digital payments, these have exploded, especially since COVID. These are sort of electronic transfers directly into bank accounts rather than mobile money. Digital ID, so this refers to very often biometric IDs. So for example, in India, there's over 1 billion people have the nationwide biometric ID, but it doesn't necessarily have to be biometric. There's, for example, my university now has moved to a digital ID system rather than a paper card, right? So it's just some sort of verifiable ID that's in digital format. Data, I don't even know where to begin. I mean, especially once you start talking about AI, just the growth has been absolutely ridiculous. And so there's a little bit less maybe to say in the specific overlap with social protection. We'll talk a little bit about this and how it can be used. Maybe not as much has been done with it, and partly because this is a bit of a double-edged sword with privacy concerns, etc. So we'll again discuss this maybe a bit later, and also in the Q&A. Okay, so it's clear that all these are sort of prevalent, widespread. What about using these technologies in social protection? So this, again, it comes a little bit as of a surprise that few governments are actually using mobile money to make transfers to beneficiaries. Now, this doesn't mean that person-to-person transfers aren't very high, or this doesn't mean that NGOs are not using it, but governments themselves seem to be a little bit reluctant. Again, maybe the data is a little bit outdated now. 4 years. This is now 4 years ago. And with COVID, a bunch of things changed, and there was a huge sort of impetus to electronic and mobile money transfers as opposed to other forms of transfers. So maybe we'll see a little bit more now. But if you look, for example, across the world, it's very surprising that even in a place like Kenya, only half or less than half of government beneficiaries who say that they are receiving benefits, even less than sort of half of them are receiving those transfers via mobile money. And the average comes out to be more like 20%. And again, these are of people who are receiving benefits anyway. So if you look at overall, only 4% of respondents received a mobile money transfer from a government. And maybe that's not perhaps that surprising, given that a lot of the mobile money sort of infrastructure is private, right? It's been built by private companies in a lot of places. Maybe there's a bit of reluctance to use that. Maybe there's a little bit of a worry that again the money might not reach the right person. So that's a little bit of a surprise. Perhaps not a little bit more positively, many people seem to be receiving digital payments, and so more than half of those who received government transfers had them get directly deposited into a bank account, and that this is very promising. And as I just mentioned, especially after COVID, there's sort of a huge acceleration in the adoption of digital payments in social protection, in emergency relief. And 80% of developing countries use some sort of digital payments. And even when I first started writing the paper on which this lecture is based, there have been big increases. So just in India, which I know a lot about, there have been huge increases in various state and central government schemes that give direct cash transfers, direct benefit transfers of cash, especially to women, but others too, or just to farmers, for example. So those have gone up dramatically, especially since COVID, and even more so the last couple of years. So now that we know that this is been widespread and is being adopted, especially for the in terms of the digital payments, how are some of the ways that digital technology could help? Okay, so I see sort of 4 ways, at least, there could be others, but 4 ways in which digital tools can improve program delivery. So the first is in targeting. So how do you actually identify and then enroll beneficiaries in a program? The second is the transferring benefits securely and quickly to identified beneficiaries. Now, those 2 might be obvious. The other 2 maybe are less obvious, and I find them really interesting. Is the third, and I think maybe once I talk about the examples, this will be clear, is that digital tools can allow you to redesign programs. So one simple example is, suppose there's a cash program and an in-kind program. I know you've talked about this. In fact, my co-authors have presented, I think, this topic. So suppose you have a food delivery program and a cash and a cash program, right? Now, some people might prefer food, some people might prefer cash. You could, with digital technology, have the ability to offer people the choice. And why is digital technology important for that? It's important so that people don't double dip, right? You need to keep track of what their choices are, especially if they're going to be changing over time. And so, we've done a lot of pilots of this type of program where you can use this technology to offer people the choice. And so that allows you to completely redesign potentially your social protection architecture. And then there's spillovers, right? By using digital technology, by using accounts, you could get empowerment, especially of women. You could see impacts on savings. You could see other general equilibrium effects as well. And so those are some of the non-obvious things. But let's start with some more straightforward benefits. And the first is sort of using data-driven targeting. And this has the potential to improve sort of accuracy of the targeting, definitely the timeliness, how fast you do, and coverage in terms of reaching areas that you may not be able to reach with sort of traditional boots on the ground methods. Okay, so there are a couple of different types of examples. So we'll go through the Togo example of using machine learning, using phone metadata to target COVID aid. And then the other nice thing you can do is you can use digital data, combine and build these kind of social protection registries. You can integrate databases, and once you've done that, you can both improve targeting, but you can also do things like, okay, you had 15 different programs targeting 15 different types of people, doing 15 different things. And now maybe you can combine this all and just have a single basic income program or a conditional transfer program. Okay, so that's one of the potential uses of digital technology. But let's go through this really fabulous example from Togo. So we'll look at this case study, which they used cash transfers to, they used machine learning and phone-based data to target COVID relief to people who otherwise would not have received it, right? So the context in Togo was that there hadn't been a sort of broad recent social registry. So there was no huge database that the government could look at and say, okay, these are the people that we should target now that COVID has hit and people don't have money. Okay, so there wasn't that. There'd been a few surveys, and then importantly, there'd been a voter registration drive, and there was a voter registry, but no sort of broad social registry. Previously, they had this program mostly in the urban areas and mostly targeting informal workers, but obviously, especially with lockdowns and people in rural areas also suffering, they wanted to do this expansion. So what they did was this program where the registrations and payments were made fully digital. So how did they do that? Well, first, they used satellite-derived poverty maps. So they use satellite data and lots of other information to use that data to pick the 100 poorest cantons. These are sort of the sort of lowest administrative unit that is consistent, that can be consistently used in Togo. Probably there are people from Togo who might correct me, but that's as far as I can believe from the paper. And then in these 100 poorest cantons, what they did was they trained a machine learning algorithm on mobile phone metadata. Okay, so what do I mean by metadata? It's not necessarily, I can identify me as an individual calling my wife or something like that, but it has lots of information. How many calls you made, where were you when you made those calls, what's the duration of your calls, who are the calls to in terms of the area. This is all sort of metadata that's collected by cell phone companies. It can be used, and it can predict whether people are poor or not. Once you have some other data, for example, a field survey, to sort of train it on, right? And then from the people that you're training the algorithm, you expand that, and you have mobile phone metadata on everybody who has a mobile phone. And then from there, you identify, okay, which are the people whose characteristics look like the poor people from the training data. Okay, and that's how you identify. You never have to actually go to the ground and actually ask people or collect their information. Everything is done sort of remotely. And that's, of course, incredibly nice when there's COVID and you don't want to spread COVID by going and doing things on the ground. Now you might ask, okay, this sounds interesting and cool, but well, how did it actually work? So luckily, what they did was they had some data from a phone survey later. Then they collected that, and they compared how this targeting worked and how the money they sent out worked compared to alternatives, right? So one alternative could be sort of geographic. So for example, you just stop at step one. That's, let's say, one alternative, right? You just pick the poorest areas. That's it. Everybody in those areas gets the money. Okay. Compared to something like that, the machine learning and phone data reduced exclusion errors by a significant amount. Now, if you had a perfectly calibrated proxy means test, hopefully, again, I think everybody knows what a proxy means test is by now, that would require huge amounts of data, right? Like a full social registry that you're comparing, that you have all this data on people's assets or incomes. Compared to that, it's not actually, perfect, of course, because you're going to have some errors. And so compared to that, there's some increases in errors, but you don't have the data and you have fixed budgets. And so with these budgets, this type of targeting is much better than even using geographic targeting in the rural context. The other nice thing is that the systematic sort of under targeting of groups did not exist, right? Which might happen under some types of geographic methods. And of course, though, you needed to have a cell phone. So that was the main sort of channel of exclusion. They use this voter ID base. So that can be an issue as well. And finally, the data has to be somewhat recent, right? So if you use sort of older data, because people are coming in and out of poverty, using older data is going to be a little bit of a problem, and that's going to reduce accuracy. Okay, so it's a really cool experiment. I mean, it wasn't an experiment. It's a really cool paper in a real world setting, and I encourage you to sort of look at read it if you're interested. The references are all in the slides themselves. Okay, so now that had to do with identifying beneficiaries. Of course, there was some transferring of benefits too. But the evaluation was about how well machine learning identified beneficiaries. Now we want to evaluate how the transferring benefits part can be affected by digital payments. And here we have lots of data that direct digital payments can reduce leakage and administrative costs. So we're going to go through the example of the workfare program in India. And we'll look at this public food program later when we're actually talking about some of the problems. But other examples that I want to highlight in India, instead of a cooking fuel subsidy, they started doing a direct benefit transfer that substantially reduced leakage and corruption. By leakage, basically, I mean, how much of the money that that the government sends is meant for beneficiaries, or how much of the transfer is sort of coming out of the system, going to intermediaries, other people, rather than the intended beneficiary, right? And so there's some really good evidence that this using direct benefit transfers worked a lot better than the alternative. And there's some great evidence from Niger, where using in a humanitarian program setting, using mobile money transfers rather than the traditional sort of method of cash delivery saved a huge amount of time in transactions costs. Okay, so we'll look at the impact of both on the impact on both leakage as well as transactions costs, time costs or money costs for both the government as well as beneficiaries. We have another nice paper that looks at using monitoring to improve how fast the money gets through by just calling up beneficiaries and asking them, hey, have you received your money? Hey, did you have to pay a bribe to get that money? Okay, and using that data, sharing that with the government, telling the officers who are in charge, hey, we're going to get this data. can also improve how fast money is getting out. Okay, but let's look at this specific program. This was the Smart Cards program in India. So what it was is basically biometrically authenticated cash outs of electronic benefit transfers for a workfare program this is a cash for work type of program. That's one of the biggest welfare programs in India. And what we did was we worked with the government to randomize how the program was rolled out across a very large area, 157 sub-districts with a population of about 19 million people. And this was a sort of as is at scale experiment using representative data, right? So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that the government implemented the program just as it's supposed to. It wasn't a very small pilot run by a very well-functioning NGO. This was just the government doing things as they usually do. And it was done at scale. Again, maybe the government can do things really, really well in one or two villages if they're targeted. But once you scale it up to 8 districts, it doesn't work anymore. So the experiment itself was at scale. So we know how it's going to work, again, when it is run by the government in a large area, okay? The other nice thing we did was we collected representative data from lots of sources, administrative data and survey data, again, making sure that it's representative of the population, which is really, really important when you're worried about, let's say, exclusion. So what was the program? So this is, people do work and they get paid. They're supposed to get paid for it. The government provides that employment, that government provides the work. So from the local level, somebody has to, ignore all these names, but somebody has to basically tell higher levels of government who the people are that did the work and how much they should be paid. Once that reaches the state level, they are going to send the money down various levels. Most of it is electronic, but at the very end, at the village level down here, people at that time didn't have bank accounts. There's no other way to get it rather than getting it through cash from the local officials. Now, these are the same officials over here who are also administering the program. So they can very easily just say, hey, Caleb worked on the program and he should be given 100 days of wages. Meanwhile, Caleb doesn't exist. And when the money comes down, the officials just get some of that money, or maybe Anna's worked on the program and she's supposed to get 100 days worth of payments. The local officials keep about 20 days worth of that wages and only give the remaining 80 to Anna. Okay, so these are the ways that money can leak out. What the intervention did, it kept the first bit the same. But now, instead of the money coming through the normal channels, it went directly to a bank and then eventually to a bank account that was in the name of the actual worker. But here's the nice thing here, which is that the worker could not take money out of that account unless they biometrically authenticated. So made sure with their fingerprint that this was the same person who the money should be going to. Okay, so that was the intervention, electronic transfers into bank accounts plus biometric authentication, fingerprint authentication. So make sure that the actual person who the money's, who worked and did, is supposed to get the money, gets the money. Okay, so that was it. That was, conceptually very, very simple. Logistically, of course, very, very, very difficult to run out. And because this was an experiment, what we could see is, we had some areas where the intervention had not happened, some areas where the intervention had happened. So we could test ourselves, getting all the data from the government, collecting our independent surveys to see what actually happened. And so it worked really, really well. There was less leakage, more work done, more people actually worked on the program. The payments were faster, easier to collect. The improvements were spread across the distribution. It's not just the best off that got the money. And basically everybody loved the program. Okay. Eventually, just the time savings, just the amount of time it took you to collect the money, if you sort of used how much you lost in wages doing that, that was higher than the program cost. So you didn't even need the fact that there was less leakage to justify this program, right? So this is just like a phenomenal program. But here's the important thing. One of the big takeaways is that before he saw all of our data, all he'd heard about was from the 2% of people who didn't like it for whatever reason. Maybe they were in cahoots with the local officials. Maybe they genuinely had problems getting the program. And because this is India, 2% of people is thousands and thousands of people. So, the chief secretary, all he heard was the complaints about the people from the program, not the benefit that it was giving to the vast majority of people, and he was about to abandon it until he saw all this data. So it's really, really important to collect this data. It's really important to do this research in a rigorous way. The second big takeaway was that almost no one was hurt because there were these fallback mechanisms. Okay, and so I'll keep coming back to this later on. But there was this fallback mechanisms. That means that even if you didn't have the biometric IDs, even if your fingerprints weren't authenticated, you could still get the money out. Now that meant that you couldn't reduce leakage down fully, but it also meant that if you were genuinely hurt, you were not going to be out of options. Okay, so that's one of the main takeaways. That's an example of how how the transferring of benefits can be affected and improved. I've mentioned redesigning programs, and I've talked a little bit about the cash or in-kind choice, but my case study here, what I want to do, show you or talk to you about is predictive flood aid. Okay, so this is again a really nice example of how with the digital tools you can sort of use, build in a lot of flexibility in the program and make it more beneficiary centric. Here, the huge flexibility comes from being able to give transfers before the disaster has struck, right? So that's really, really impressive. This is really, really cool. So what happened here? So there's Bangladesh. Bangladesh gets a lot of flooding. It's in the Delta region. Some of this flooding is actually very predictable. You know where the rains are happening. You know where the rivers are going to be flooded. So based on that, you can sort of target transfers. Okay, we know who the people are who are living in this flood zone. We know they're going to get flooded. Why don't we target them even before the flooding happens, right? And so this was exactly the program. And the World Food Program used sort of this vulnerability mapping analysis. Fun fact, in all the way back in 1998, I was an intern in the vulnerability analysis and mapping division of the World Food Program for one summer. But they do some great work, and they're able to predict where where the floods are going to hit. We know that there's all these people living there, so why don't we send them the money? Okay, and the funds arrive before the conventional sort of relief, which happens many days after the flooding, because it's really hard to get to the flood zone after it's flooded, right? So this is really cool. So you can use the digital maps, you can use the fact that people have these mobile phones and just send them cash directly. How do we know it worked? Well, you need to have some control group who maybe could have gotten the funds but didn't for various reasons. And this is where this paper is really nice. There were some constraints related to COVID. The money couldn't go out. There's one telecom provider. They couldn't get out money to certain people. And that creates some variation in who got the anticipatory transfers and who got the regular transfers. And after the floods, about 3 months after, they collected a survey of households and measured food security, asset loss, et cetera, and overall well-being. And then you have this comparison group who got regular funding and the anticipatory transfer group. Okay. And they found that these kind of anticipatory transfers really had a big impact. They improved welfare, they increased food consumption, they reduced asset losses, they reduced the requirement, the need to get emergency loans that are very, very high interest. And what's really nice is they can see, because there was some variation in exactly where money came and exactly when people got money after the floods. And they say that, the timing really matters, right? Like if you get money 2 months after the floods, you've already suffered quite a lot. So that's not really, really helpful. Getting money even before the floods is really helpful, because then when the floods happen and you don't have any assets, you don't have any income, you can really use that. All right. So this suggests that this kind of the feasibility of doing this kind of scaled up forecasting, especially as climate disasters are going to be more and more prevalent in the near future. Okay, so that was a sort of very interesting, maybe something that maybe people haven't necessarily thought about in terms of the benefits of digital technology. Another thing that you may not have thought of is sort of how this could perhaps drive other outcomes, have spillovers to other outcomes related to financial security, related to women's empowerment. So you can see sort of increased precautionary savings, you can see increased consumption smoothings, you could potentially have general equilibrium effects. But really, in some ways, if people are using these digital bank accounts, that could have spillovers onto other things like labor supply and women's empowerment. And so that's sort of the case study here. So this is a really nice experiment done in India, where the female labor force participation rate is actually very low. It's surprisingly low for a country at the stage of development that India is in. And so what this study does is it tests whether sort of increasing women's control over their own earnings can relax some constraints that are relying on sort of norms that men say their wives shouldn't work outside the house. Okay, so what was the experiment? This was an experiment where they opened bank accounts for women. Then for that same workfare program that I talked about earlier, they did direct deposits of that money into women's individual accounts rather than their husband's accounts, as used to be the case. And they also gave them training on account use. Okay. And their main comparison is going to be people who got just the accounts versus women who got only the accounts. So you're keeping sort of financial access constant versus women who got money paid into their accounts and also training on how to use those accounts. Okay. And they have a large sample. Again, it's representative. They do these careful studies and follow-ups after 1 year and 3 years. And what they find is that they have the sort of paying money through digital transfers, direct transfers into women's accounts, increased how much work they did outside the house by a pretty significant amount. And the interesting thing is they worked both in the public sector, which is this workfare program that the government provides, but also other places, the private sector. And again, importantly, the sort of biggest effects were amongst women who previously had not worked on this public sector program. Okay, so these were sort of the constrained women in the sense that their husbands were really not allowing them to work But now they're seeing this. They're getting they're getting these accounts. They're getting their payments, and they want to sort of work more. Okay. There's other sort of impacts on norms. The men became a little bit more accepting of their wives' works once they actually started. And it also perceived community norms also changed. Okay, so that's really interesting, because here you're not doing some training program and telling men, oh, your wives should work or something like that, or you should allow your wives to work. This was sort of a program that was sort of getting transfers to women in their own accounts, directly deposited with control over their own accounts. And that had this sort of spillover effect on their labor supply and empowerment. Okay, so far so good. Lots of really nifty little papers and experiments and demonstrations of how digital technology can be really great. But as we all know, there's sort of no free lunch. There could be costs, and that's what I want to discuss a little bit. Unfortunately, where potentially you have the potential for the biggest sort of cost overall is where we have very, very limited data, very limited experimentation, of course, and so, it's going to be perhaps a little bit unsatisfactory, but, many of you are students. Maybe this is something that you will eventually work on. But let me start with the things that we do know about. And, the most sort of obvious potential sort of pitfall is the potential to exclude beneficiaries, and especially exclude the sort of most vulnerable people. So why is that? Well, these groups, the poorest, might have just not have the digital IDs or don't have mobile phones to get transfers, right? So that could be possible. In India, there's some sort of broad evidence to suggest that it's 2.5% of people were excluded from various benefit programs because Aadhaar is the biometric ID. You'll learn a little bit about it soon. They had some problem, whether they didn't have it or wasn't getting authenticated or something like that. This is the example that we're going to talk about right now. This is the case study. But what I want to highlight is that, measuring whether people are excluded or whether people are hurt can only really be done through this kind of mostly costly field verification, right? So if you're excluded, you're not on the beneficiary rolls at all. How are you going to reach these people to even ask whether you're getting your benefits, right? If you're using a phone survey to check whether people have access, but people don't have phones that itself, how are you going to know whether they're not being able to access the program, right? So to be able to really focus in on exclusion, you're going to have to go out there, which is very, very costly. Okay, so that's one takeaway. I'll come back to it a little bit later. But first, let me talk about the experiment that we did. Again, it was very, very similar to the initial workfare program experiment in conceptualization, but very different in the details. So what's a little bit of the context here? So Aadhaar is India's biometric ID, is the world's largest biometric ID rollout. So there's fingerprints and iris. Those are the biometric indicators collected to a unique number. And there's huge numbers that we're talking about here. So IDs are, about 98% of the population, nearly 1.5 billion people have these. People have come out on either sides of this. The government at the time said it's going to be a game changer for governance. Critics said that this is going to be really problematic because lots of people are going to be excluded. So what we did was we looked at how it's used in India's sort of subsidized food aid system, led to either benefits or cost. And similar to the previous experiment, this is again an as is at scale evaluation, right? So we, this was run by the government. All we did was randomize where the program was going to use biometric authentication and where it wasn't. And then we used a combination of our own surveys and government data to figure out what happened. So what's the program? What's the food aid program? The government, think of it as basically the government is sending sacks of rice through an agent called a fair price shop to beneficiaries. Okay, so the government sends it. The local agent in the village will basically give the people come to this local agent to get these sacks of rice. Now, what the government did was it used Aadhaar-based biometric authentication. What does that mean? Is that when you come to collect your rice, the agent has to authenticate your fingerprint to make sure that you are actually a beneficiary on the benefit rolls who's collecting the rice. And they can only give out this rice if you are verified. Okay, so that was the idea. The hope was that then the leakage would stop because the rice wasn't going to people who were not on the rolls, or invented people or ghost people or anything like that. That was the idea. When we looked at the data, basically what happened is nothing, right? So nothing on average, but there was a higher proportion of treatment households that got zero value. So that means that they were excluded, especially for those who were the worst off. Okay, and so that on average there was no change in leakage. So leakage didn't go down. No change in benefit delivery for the average person, but for the worst off, a few people lost their benefits. So far, that's not very good. The government now decides, well, let's sort of build more on this digital public infrastructure. Let's use the data that we're collecting here to then decide how much rice to send out, right? So if in month one, you only have authenticated records for 50 sacks of rice, that means you're only serving 50 customers. Next month, we're going to reduce your distribution value, and we're only going to send you 50 sacks of rice rather than 100 to begin with. Okay, so this was called reconciliation. So that's what they started to do, and that had a dramatic impact. So it dramatically reduced leakage, but it also dramatically reduced the amount of money, of food aid that was going out. So you'll see that treatment is actually now lower than control. And why this happened is, of course, now these fair price, the agents running the shop who were previously benefiting from the leakage cannot benefit anymore, and they don't have any grain to send out because they've already sold it off or sent it off elsewhere. And so people really, really suffered. Okay. And so this really highlights these trade-offs, right? This sort of strict ID plus reconciliation system meant that you reduced leakage, but you also increase exclusion a lot. Okay, and these kind of sort of shadow costs of reducing leakage and corruption may actually be higher, let's say, than the direct costs. Again, highlighting that it's not necessarily technology itself, but how it's implemented, and it's not technology itself. It's not where it's implemented, but it's more about how it's implemented. And the idea here is, again, the government, all it cared about was the savings, the fiscal savings. not necessarily the beneficiary experience. And so beneficiaries were really worse off. The second sort of pitfall can be related to transactions costs. And so when do these occur? When there's sort of failures with the technology, right? The authentication doesn't work. They say, sorry, I can't give you food. Or, oh, the mobile money transfer didn't go through because of some glitch. Okay. And that can be really, really costly, especially if people are really, really poor. So one example here is an experiment done in Afghanistan where the authors worked with a very large NGO as they transitioned from paying their workers or their worker salaries in cash to instead to mobile payments. Okay. And what they did was, they did this experiment with a small number of employees where some of them received their salary via mobile money and others continue to receive their salary in cash. To make sure that this is not just the impact of having a mobile phone, everybody at least had mobile phones, SIM cards, and training on how to use the mobile phones, okay? And they used data from sort of monthly surveys, the administrative payrolls, and transaction records. So like in India, in some sense, there were huge cost savings for the firm, or this could be the government, for example. The amount of money that they needed to sort of disburse salaries went down dramatically. There were no other changes on welfare, but there were some big effects, well, not reasonably modest effects on delays and transactions costs, right? And that mainly happened because the agent network from whom you cash out the mobile payments wasn't quite there all over Afghanistan, and people weren't able to access their money. Overall, though, what we see is that all the gains from using the technology is coming to the employers and operators, not the beneficiaries, right? And so that highlights this sort of broader pattern where, yes, maybe this is good. Maybe it's changing the bottom line for the government, but people are going to be hurt. Okay, so that's something that we need to be really, really aware of. All right, so final sort of cost. Again, I have very little to say to this on this because there's very little research being done, and it's hard to know how to even design an experiment in this case. But I would love if some of you did more work on this, which is on the sort of data privacy concerns, and sort of gaps in legal systems, right? So many countries don't even have data protection laws, and even the countries they do, it's all about the implementation, right? How is it going to be implemented? How are you going to follow the letter of the law? Are there going to be lots of exceptions for government, and governments can do whatever they want? In which case, what's the point of the law to begin with, right? And so implementation of the law, enforcement of the law, matters a lot, and especially in contexts where people don't have the technical capacity to deal with issues that arise. That's going to really sort of affect how these systems are used in an accountable fashion. All right, so we're over the hour, but I don't have that much more left. I just want to talk about the sort of broad policy takeaways and quickly talk about this, and then I'll open it up. So the first sort of takeaway from the research that I've done myself and the research that I've seen is that you want to make sure that you're using technology appropriately, right? You're not using it just because it's there. There has to be some objective. Why are you using this technology? What is it exactly going to do? How is it going to reduce leakage? What are the ways that leakage is taking place right now? How will it cut out leakage? Think about that before sort of implementing that technology, okay? If you're sort of prioritizing the beneficiary experience, inclusion, and other fallback mechanisms, the leakage reductions, the fiscal savings will come along the way. If you prioritize this, you're going to avoid the sort of pitfalls of making some of the worst people in the world even worse off. Okay, some of the poorest people in the world, I should say, sorry, even worse off. I think there's a case to be made to strengthen the sort of laws related to data governance and privacy. And you know, at the same time, this might seem almost in tension with this, but if done in the proper way, that can really help you sort of reach your objectives in social protection is sort of you know, investing in sort of real-time monitoring and evaluation. So this was this phone survey that we did, outbound phone calls that we did in an Indian state, to be able to see whether benefits were being delivered or not. We have another sort of experiment in a different state doing similar kinds of things, but this kind of investment can really pay off in the long run. And what I want to also push for is, you know, academics don't seem to like doing an experiment that's already been done somewhere else just because in a different context, just because they think they're not going to be able to publish it. But these are really, really important because sometimes the context really does matter. And we want to be able to generalize some of this evidence, not just rely on 10 different studies. So that's something that I think should be a very high priority. We need to know a lot more about how we can use AI to sort of determine, to target, to determine eligibility, to reduce fraud. It could be even used in some of those early warning, anticipatory transfers kind of things. But we need to make sure this happens without amplifying bias. We know less about sort of general equilibrium and network effects of digital public infrastructure. We need to be able to come up with scalable designs for some of these really interesting, flexible social protection systems. And again, you know, the context is important. We, you know, it would be really nice to be able to do sort of some kind of coordinated multi-country research, like was done for the microfinance work, where they did, you know, 6 or 7 different experiments that were very similar in different contexts. So that's it. I won't even walk through my conclusion slide. I think it's more important to get to the Q&A. But all these slides should already be up on the website. So I think people in the room can go ahead and ask questions.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much, Professor Suktankar. I have collated a few questions from the Q&A chat, but maybe let's start with 2 live questions and then we can switch. Does that sound all right?
Sounds great.
Okay, first I see Darshana, if you want to ask your question, and then Shadwa.
Hello.
Hey, we can hear you.
All right. Okay. So hi. I actually worked with MGNREGA workers to assess the push and pull factors of the program on ground in India.
Great.
I agree that the whole dignity aspect associated with government work pulled a lot of women into the workforce. However, regarding the smart card program, I found that the Gram Panchayat administration weren't necessarily equipped to deal with the tech side of things, because in the end MGNREGA is a rural program. The mates who are actually those who overlook the group's work and handle the smart cards were essentially being pushed out of the program due to the lack of training, difficulty in adapting to these, because these are mostly women above 50, and also they weren't being compensated for the network charges spent on all this. And there is no redressal system for women who often felt excessively monitored by mates in their place of work, leading to clashes and ultimately pulling out of the workforce. So, my question is, How do we accommodate digital tech in a social protection program that is so all encompassing in a nation where rural digital infra isn't adequate? How important is the development of peripheral systems?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, I think the capacity at the local level to handle some of the technology um, is can be really limited, and um, that's sort of a huge issue. But I wouldn't necessarily say that's related that's sort of limited to digital technology itself, right? So we see this when you're talking about the MGNREGS program. We know, for example, that the poorest states in India, like Bihar, don't actually take advantage of it because they don't have the capacity to even implement the program. Forget about implementing it in a digital way, right? And so I think you raised an important point, and I think I think this has to go. The implementation of the technology has to go hand in hand with training and support to be able to implement it at the local level.
All right, thank you.
Shadwa?
Yeah, thank you so much for a very much needed presentation and informative work. I was wondering about Egypt specifically because we have a lot of informal workers. So in this case, like income records might not be very well fit. So in this case, alternative data like mobile transaction histories and also mobile usage could be very important in the case of Egypt. However, to what extent you think the conditions of institutions and governance, what kind of institutional and governance conditions are needed in order to ensure a reliable welfare targeting in the case of informal workers using alternative data like mobile records and stuff? Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, I think this is also tied very much so to the issue of sort of data protection and what governments might do or might be able to do if they have all your cell phone records, right? So that becomes a little bit potentially problematic, definitely potentially scary. So I think I'm I'm not necessarily always all in on all the technology, right? I think it needs to be done in a very cautious way. I think the fallbacks need to be in place. I think the sort of um, I'm fishing for the right here, not quite restrictions, but the oversight needs to be there so that the technology can be used in a very in an appropriate way, let's say. But to your broader question, like you're exactly right. Like the informal workers. So the Togo program that I talked about, the initial targeting was simply whether you were in the informal sector or not. And that could be used, and for them that was enough to say that okay, you were not in a formal sector job, so you likely needed assistance. So and then you can imagine that plus sort of mobile metadata can be really useful to be able to target aid, and can be very powerful. But at the same time, again, what kind of records are transferred? How can you ensure that it's only the metadata? All of that, those sort of controls and restrictions need to be in place. And I mean, I'm seeing this; they have to be in place. But I mean, I don't know exactly how to put them in place, right? That obviously has to be done at the country level.
Thank you so
Thanks.
much.
I'd like to shift now to the Q&A. There are a few, I think, parallel questions where several participants have raised the issue that in developing countries, digital infrastructure like servers or cybersecurity systems are weak or externally hosted, and this raises a risk of hacking or data breaches, misuse of sensitive information in general, and I'm getting a underlying sense of maybe mistrust the idea of digital payments rather than maybe a more confident thing in your hand. What would you say to that? And any safeguards or policy frameworks that could help in such contexts?
Yeah, I mean, I completely understand where that distrust is coming from, right? I think as I mentioned, this is an area where we know so little, and this is an area where again the sort of digital protection frameworks don't exist, the laws don't exist. What happens if you get hacked? Who's responsible? If you build a social registry and then it gets hacked and all your information gets leaked, it's not clear. This is going to be really unsatisfactory, but I don't really have the answers, right? Like I don't know what I don't know, other than just building up these protection frameworks, other than building up the legal infrastructure. I don't know what else can necessarily be done. So I mean, I think this could be a really interesting area of research. I think I see where the sort of skepticism comes from. Yeah, that's all I have to say.
No, that's great. There was another question, I think, from Kasim Sayad that highlighted an equity issue around a gender disparity in mobile phone ownership, especially in rural areas. If mobile access is skewed, what alternative digital tools can help ensure that women aren't left out of these social protection programs?
That's a great question. So I think that was something that was on the minds of lots of researchers. I think that's probably going to be true in lots of cases, and in lots of different contexts where there is not gender parity in cell phone ownership. But and then again, I completely agree. I'll point out though two the two pieces of evidence here, which is one is again from that Togo study where they actually found that there weren't huge gender gaps in receipt of the funds through the mobile system. So that's one, and the second is not necessarily the India empowerment study by itself, but just this idea that this could have the potential to reach people who don't have access, and in fact the people who maybe women who don't have access have perhaps the greatest to benefit from that access, right? In some way. And so I understand that and agree that I think you shouldn't just be switching everything to mobile transfers. And then again, that's why I say more research is needed. I know it's like the economist cop out, right, all the time, but here it's really true. I mean, there's just so few papers, and I'll keep all I can do is keep pointing to those same pieces of evidence, right? So we really do need more work. Fortunately the bits of evidence, the small pieces of evidence we have, provides a little bit of a hopeful picture. But I know that this is not going to be true in all contexts. I mean, I'm 100% confident that in many different contexts, you will have these gaps, these gender gaps, and switching social protection systems to mobile money everywhere is maybe not the best idea. And maybe that is one of the reasons why you don't see governments using mobile transfers as much. And the people that have been using them, NGOs, what they do go out and give mobile phones to people, right? They give mobile phones to everyone, so then they can access the transfers. Or even in India, when you're seeing these big digital payment going to women. One of the things they did as a precursor was went around and opened a huge number of these no frills bank accounts for women. And so that, again, those accounts can then have spillovers, right? Like we've seen in the Madhya Pradesh experiment. So I think, sum up a very long response. One, I agree that there are gender gaps, and those could be sort of exacerbated. Two, though, the evidence we have suggests that maybe those could be worked around. And three, there's a real opportunity here to use digital technology to not only close those gaps, but then have positive spillovers on other outcomes as well.
Brilliant. Thank you. Let's go now to the live Q&A. I see that Mabel is next, if you'd like to ask your question.
Yes, thank you. My question is on, we are currently preparing for the social registry in Zimbabwe.
Nice.
So, yes, we are collecting data from province by province. We are picking a district of which has got very poor people, most vulnerable people. So we are planning to collect the consumption module just after the social registry, the other modules. So now my question is, after we collected the consumption module for the PMT, for future purposes in terms of cost reduction, can we have the machine learning whereby in this social registry we are collecting the GPS and other variables and also the phone numbers and the ID, although the IDs are not biometric. So
Yeah.
how best can we take on the ML?
I think there is an issue with his headphone.
You're not hearing me?
No, right. It's a little bit soft, but I think I can still hear you.
Okay.
I'm not hearing anything. I don't know.
Sorry, if you could keep your mic muted until it's your turn, that'd be great. I can hear you, Mabel. You're a little quiet, but
Yeah,
we've been able to hear your whole question.
Okay, I wanted to say, after we have collected the consumption module and also the social registry questionnaire without the consumption module, we'll do the PMT. So in the near future, in terms of saving costs, like we want to see the consumption, if it is smooth or if it is changed, can we adopt the machine learning, and how best can we do it? Because on the questionnaire, we're collecting the phone number, the GPS, and other variables. That's my question. Thank you.
That's a great question, Mabel, and that's it's just very much in line with some of the work we've seen. So I think it can be done. I think one would need to really sort of adapt it to your particular context. But as we discussed, as I was talking about the delay in the data, everyone knows this, that people go in and out of poverty. You spend a lot of time collecting the social registry data. You have a consumption module. You have this proxy means test, and then 18 months from now it's outdated, right? So Mabel's question is sort of how do could we potentially use machine learning? We have their cell phone numbers, we have their GPS coordinates. Could we use that? And I think it's really possible. It's a really important question. I think you could look at maybe you have data of 2 points in time. Maybe you collect data in the next round, not for everybody else, not for everybody, but a select sample, and then use machine learning to sort of train it to look at sort of what sort of happened, what static variables are predictive of the dynamic changes, right? And if you have a lot of rich data, and if you have the mobile phone data, maybe you can combine that with the metadata. I think this is possible. I mean, it may not be perfect, but it possibly, likely is going to be a lot cheaper than going out and doing another social registry or another update of consumption module 18 months down the line, right? but that's super fascinating. I think it should be doable with a little bit more data, with some updates, some dynamic indicators that then could potentially be predicted by some of the static indicators that you've had previously, and using a machine learning algorithm to do these sort of out of sample predictions. But that's really fantastic that you're doing that right now.
Thank you.
And a very, very relevant question.
Yeah.
We'll turn now to Sushma. If you want to ask your question, and just because of time, if you could keep it brief. Thanks.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Caleb. I will be brief. So, in continuity with the question that Sadhva had asked a few moments later, so I also had a similar question related with the informal sector workers. Since I'm from India, and I'm mostly interested in the geographically fragile regions like the Northeast and the Himalayan regions. So, I'm looking at the poverty aspect of the informal workers. So, it's like a triple whammy, right? So, informality is there, marginality at the space context, and then poverty, and then gender issues. So how, and when we talk about the mobile coordinates and all that thing, I went for a primary survey, field survey, dealing with these informal workers in Sikkim and Darjeeling, which is also again a hilly region. So the mobile phone, even they are using, it's not the smartphone they are using, right? There's the green and the red button, right? So how do we incorporate digital, and in terms of policy implications also, the some of the schemes that I was asking them, the awareness level is very nil. They hardly are aware of these schemes at the ground level. So how do we incorporate, this digitalization, and incorporate into improving, into making some concrete policy prescriptions for these people, right?
Yeah.
And again,
Yeah.
informal sector is a very heterogeneous sector. So you have the upper tier sector, and then you have the lower tier sector, as enumerated by Phil's in his 990 paper. So how do we bring this lower segment who are stuck in this work to bring them out of poverty and catch up with that?
I
Thank
think
you.
bringing out of poverty is a broader question, but I think I can speak to sort of reaching them. So and I think there's two sort of things that we've learned so far, which may be relevant here. So one is the cell phone metadata. I mean, that doesn't necessarily require smartphones, right? So even if you have the sort of red and green buttons, as you say, those phones, just one indicator could simply be the use of those phones, right? If you're seeing that they're not consuming data, they're only consuming cellular services, that in itself could be an indicator, and that can be used for targeting. The second is just, if people still have the phones and still are be able to, we can reach them, then you can think about designing systems that are using outbound calls. And those could be made to sort of get people to enroll in programs, to increase awareness. As you said, awareness is very low. So you could use those to potentially increase awareness amongst this population, which, as you point out, is very marginalized. So those are two things that I can think about, to that are sort of relevant for today's lecture.
Thank you. I'm afraid, everyone, that we are out of time, but just wanted to give a big thank you to Professor Sandeep Suktankar for your time and your experience. I think we've had a lot of lectures, but this one just seemed to be very specific to the case studies, and very, I think, thought out as far as the examples went, that a lot of people resonated with. So thank you. And everyone, today marks the point where we passed 50% in the series. So congratulations. We'll have our next lecture next week on public health insurance, and Pascaline Dupont and Radhika Jain will be teaching that. So we look forward to seeing you again then.
Great. Thank you for your time, everyone.
Thank you. Have a great rest of your
Okay,
day, everyone.
Professor Sandeep,
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
You.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, thank you. But Caleb, we didn't share
Thank
very well
you.
the time.
Thank you.